Welcome to Serial Killer Files, brought to you by Skoob, where the truth is darker than fiction. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today, we're riding straight into one of America's coldest, most calculated nightmares. This isn't just a story of murder. It's a tale of deception, control, and the devil hiding in plain sight. We're talking about Dennis Rader, the man who called himself BTK, bind, torture, kill. He was a family man, a church leader, and a monster. So brace yourselves, as we're heading deep into the dark mind of a killer who fooled an entire town for decades. Picture this. It's a typical Sunday morning in Wichita, Kansas. Families are gathering for church, children are playing in quiet neighborhoods, and at Christ Lutheran Church, the congregation looks up respectfully at their council president, a polite, well-mannered man who seems like the epitome of community leadership. What they don't know is that they're listening to one of America's most notorious serial killers. Dennis Rader wasn't your stereotypical movie villain with wild eyes and erratic behavior. He was terrifyingly ordinary. By day, he worked as a compliance officer. Ironic, isn't it? Ensuring others followed the rules while he systematically broke the most fundamental laws of human decency. He had a wife, children, and was actively involved in his community. He was the guy you'd nod to at the grocery store, maybe chat with about the weather. But behind this carefully constructed mask lived BTK, an acronym that would send chills down the spines of Wichita residents for over 3 decades. Bind, torture, kill. 3 words that perfectly encapsulated his brutal methodology and the terrifying control he exercised over his victims. What makes Rader's case so particularly disturbing isn't just the horrific nature of his crimes. It's how masterfully he compartmentalized his existence. While BTK was fantasizing about stalking and murdering innocent people, Dennis Rader was tucking his children into bed, attending church meetings, and maintaining what everyone believed was a normal, even admirable life. From his earliest years, Rader harbored sadistic sexual fantasies about torturing what he described as trapped and helpless women. But here's where the story gets even more twisted. He didn't just fantasize. He actively prepared for his crimes through disturbing rituals. He would spy on female neighbors while dressed in stolen women's clothing, engage in dangerous autoerotic practices, and create elaborate fantasy scenarios. During what experts call his cooling-off periods between murders, Rader engaged in a ritual so bizarre it defies comprehension. He would photograph himself dressed in women's clothing, wearing female masks, bound with ropes, essentially role-playing as his own victims. This wasn't just about reliving his crimes. It was about feeding a psychological need that would ultimately lead to his downfall years later. The most chilling aspect? Despite these secret behaviors, Rader was widely regarded in his community as polite, well-mannered, and completely ordinary. He had mastered the art of the double life to a degree that would make professional actors envious. Now you might be wondering, how does someone become this? What creates a monster who can flip between Sunday school leader and sadistic killer with such ease? To understand Dennis Rader, we need to dive into the psychological profile that experts developed during the height of the BTK investigation. The BTK Strangler's murders weren't random acts of violence. They were the physical manifestation of a carefully constructed fantasy world. In this twisted reality, Rader was finally essential, finally dominant, finally significant. You see, at his core, Dennis Rader was an insignificant individual, a non-entity who discovered that through his crimes, he could elevate his status. Suddenly, BTK was a recognized figure, receiving the attention he believed he'd been denied his entire life. But here's what's particularly telling about Rader's psychology: his complete lack of originality. He modeled his behavior on infamous killers like New York's Son of Sam, drawing language for his taunting letters from detective magazines. This copycat behavior underscores his fundamental inadequacy. Even in his crimes, he couldn't be original. Psychological experts painted a picture of someone who was isolated, solitary, and deeply introverted. This wasn't someone who could maintain normal relationships. His entire world was dominated by fantasy and magical thinking. The murders weren't just about killing. They were a misguided attempt to find love and acceptance through the ultimate act of control. Think about the profound fear that must have driven Rader. He was scared of everyone, including himself. Experts doubted he'd ever had a normal relationship with a woman or enjoyed typical social interactions. When he wasn't actively committing murder, he battled intense fear that he wasn't normal. And ironically, he was right. This is why his victim selection was so specific and revealing. Rader didn't target random people. He chose individuals who were loving, outgoing, and sociable. These victims represented everything he wasn't and could never be. They were people who formed genuine connections, who were liked and loved, who possessed the very qualities that Rader's damaged psychology made impossible for him to develop. His victims had to be in vulnerable positions where he could completely incapacitate them, because that's the only way Rader could feel powerful. In his normal life, he was powerless, insignificant, overlooked. But in those terrifying moments with his victims, he became the center of someone's universe, albeit in the most horrific way imaginable. The psychological profile suggested a dysfunctional family background, likely raised by a domineering mother with inconsistent discipline, probably losing his father early through separation or death. He was an average student, known more for disrupting classes than academic achievement. His language and statements suggested military background and interest in police work, professions that offered structure and authority he craved. Let me take you inside one of Rader's most revealing crimes, the murder of Catherine Bright. This case is particularly significant because it shows us what happened when Rader's meticulous planning collided with unexpected circumstances. Rader had been stalking Catherine, and he'd developed what he called Project Lights Out, a name that reveals his grandiose view of his crimes. To avoid police connecting this murder to his previous crime at Theodoros, he deliberately changed his modus operandi. He left Catherine's phone line intact and brought different weapons, a .357 Magnum pistol in addition to his usual .22 handgun. Picture this scene. Rader arrives at Catherine's home posing as a college student, carrying books to blend in. When no one answers the front door, he circles the house and breaks the glass on the back door. But here's a detail that reveals his obsessive nature. He carefully swept up the broken pieces. Even during a break-in, he couldn't tolerate mess or evidence. Once inside, he takes time to familiarize himself with the house layout before settling into Catherine's closet, using her clothes as a makeshift chair. But then something goes wrong. He accidentally fires the .22. Now he's worried Catherine will smell the gunpowder when she returns. And here's where we see how his double life affected even his crimes. He's getting impatient because his wife Paula is expecting him home, and he doesn't want to cause suspicion. Think about that for a moment. In the middle of preparing to commit murder, he's worried about being late for dinner with his family. When Catherine arrives, Rader gets his first major surprise. She's not alone. Her brother Kevin is with her. Suddenly, his carefully laid plans are in chaos. He confronts them with his gun, spinning a story about being wanted in California and needing food, a car, and money. But when Catherine refuses to give him her keys, his mask begins to slip. What follows is a terrifying game of control. He forces Kevin to tie up his sister, then ties up Kevin in another room, turning the music up loud to muffle sounds. He alternates between rooms, talking to each victim, a pattern that reveals his need to maintain psychological dominance over the situation. But then everything goes wrong. When Rader tries to strangle Kevin with a stocking, not as effective as his preferred Venetian blind cord, Kevin fights back. Despite his small size, Kevin knows he's fighting for his life. He manages to break free and grab Rader's .357, shooting twice before the gun jams. In that moment, we see the real Dennis Rader, not the calculated killer, but a panicked, desperate man who nearly got overpowered by one of his intended victims. He manages to regain control, retrieves his .22, and shoots Kevin in the forehead, leaving him for dead before returning to Catherine. This case reveals so much about Rader's psychology, his need for complete control, his panic when plans go awry, and his ability to improvise violence when necessary. After the Bright murder, BTK seemed to vanish. For 13 years, Wichita held its collective breath, wondering if their bogeyman was gone, dead, or simply waiting. What they didn't know was that Dennis Rader was living among them all along, watching news reports about BTK with his wife, participating in church activities, and maintaining his facade of normalcy. But BTK wasn't really gone. He was evolving, planning, and feeding his fantasies in increasingly disturbing ways. During these quiet years, Rader continued his ritualistic photography sessions, dressing in women's clothing and masks, binding himself to recreate his victims' experiences. He was building what he would later call BTK Productions, a comprehensive archive of his crimes that he planned to leave behind as his twisted legacy. The years passed. Rader aged, his children grew up, his community continued to see him as a pillar of respectability. He worked his compliance officer job with dedication, enforcing rules and regulations while harboring the ultimate secret. The irony was completely lost on him. The man ensuring others followed the law was one of the most wanted criminals in Kansas history. Then, on January 17, 2004, something changed everything. Picture Dennis Rader on a typical weekend morning, sitting with his newspaper and coffee, a scene played out in millions of American homes. He often spent these quiet moments meticulously reading the Wichita Eagle, occasionally clipping articles or advertisements featuring women for his disturbing collection. But this morning was different. As he unfolded the paper, a headline stopped him cold. BTK Case Unsolved 30 Years Later. Journalist Hearst Laviana had written a retrospective piece about Wichita's greatest unsolved mystery. The article detailed the terror that had gripped the city in the 1970s, the victims, the 100,000-hour investigation that had yielded nothing. It asked the questions that had haunted Wichita. How could a city known for excellent police work fail to catch this predator? Why had the FBI and national resources been unable to crack the case? Would the truth ever be revealed? Most provocatively, the article speculated that by 2004 these questions were probably irrelevant. BTK was likely dead. Rader read the article multiple times, nodding in agreement with some parts, smirking at others. It triggered powerful memories from what he considered his prime years in his 30s and 40s, when he felt unstoppable, untraceable, invincible. At nearly 59, Rader had essentially retired his BTK persona. He'd been planning to digitize all of BTK's materials, drawings, photos, writings, and store them in a safe deposit box to be discovered after his death. These CDs would detail every aspect of his criminal career, complete with credits listing everyone involved in his saga, like a twisted movie production. The thought of this posthumous revelation delighted him. It would shock his wife and children, his fellow church members, the entire city of Wichita, and its police department. The bogeyman they'd feared had been living among them all along, and they would only solve their mystery after his death. he would have the ultimate satisfaction of never spending a day in prison. But one section of the article particularly stung. It mentioned attorney Robert Beatty, who was writing a book about BTK. Despite the general belief that BTK was dead, Beatty held out hope that his book might generate new leads, though he doubted BTK himself would ever make contact. That doubt, that assumption that BTK was gone forever, apparently triggered something in Rader. The article had awakened the sleeping monster. After more than a decade of silence, BTK was about to make the mistake that would end his reign of terror. But first, let me set the scene for you. The BTK task force had been working almost a year with little progress, operating in freezing conditions on the 6th floor of City Hall. Their move to the luxurious Epic Center wasn't just about comfort. It was about morale and security. The FBI offices there had motion sensors and alarms, and the location offered discretion from the constantly watching media. It was to this new command center that BTK sent what would become his downfall, a simple floppy disk. When Detective Gouge received the diskette, he handed it to Detective Randy Stone, the team's computer forensics expert. Several officers gathered around as Stone prepared for what he expected would be a lengthy, possibly fruitless examination. But within minutes, Stone found a single file labeled Test A-RTF, containing a brief note directing readers to a 3x5 card for further communication instructions. Then Stone did what any good investigator does. He dug deeper into the disk's properties. What he found was shocking in its simplicity. The phrases Christ Lutheran Church and Dennis, plus evidence that the diskette had been used at the Park City Public Library. In less than 2 hours, Stone had searched the internet and found Dennis Rader, president of Christ Lutheran Church in Park City, also employed as a compliance officer, living at 6220 Independence Street. Could it really be this simple? Was this the man they'd been hunting for over 30 years? Or was it an elaborate misdirection? The package also contained an index card where BTK had written about numbering future communications to prevent loss. But one word made Stone suspicious: EnCase. EnCase is sophisticated forensic software used by police and FBI. Was BTK taunting them, suggesting the diskette's data might be fabricated? When Stone contacted the FBI's Regional Computer Forensic Lab in Kansas City, his suspicions were confirmed. BTK was indeed trying to trap them. But in his attempt to be clever, Rader had revealed himself. While investigators were analyzing the diskette, another piece of evidence was sitting unnoticed by a rural road. On January 17th, the same day Rader read that newspaper article, a Post Toasties cereal box appeared by North Seneca near 69th Street, not far from Park City. The box was no accident. The T in Toasties was circled, with B&K added above and below. Red crepe paper spilled from the box, and it was carefully positioned against a road sign, weighted down with a brick. A few days later, Cindy Plant, an animal control officer who worked alongside Rader, drove down that same road. She noticed the unusual cereal box but dismissed it as harmless litter. She had no idea she was looking at evidence from her colleague's twisted game. Meanwhile, Rader sent a postcard to Cake TV station using the return address of the Oteros, his 1974 victims. The postcard directed them to communication number 8 at the cereal box location. When Cake alerted police and they retrieved the box, they found jewelry, more BTK writings titled Chapter 9 Hits, PJ Little Mech 01-15-1974, and a doll with rope around its neck, tied to a curved plastic pipe, a sick representation of Josephine Otero, who had been hung from a sewer pipe. The technical language in BTK's writing revealed familiarity with FBI profiling jargon from the 1970s, showing this wasn't just a random killer. This was someone who studied his craft, who understood the game between killer and investigator. One of the most fascinating aspects of the BTK investigation was how investigators used 1970s technology to track a killer. Through partnerships with Xerox, Potlatch Paper, Great Northern Nakusa Paper, and Nashua Toner Laboratories, detectives identified the exact brands of copy machines, toner, and paper used for BTK's photocopied letters. This led to an exhaustive search for photocopy machines operational in February 1978 and June 1979 that used these specific combinations. The investigation narrowed down to just 3 machines in the Wichita area. The Pitney Bowes PBC machine in the downtown Wichita Public Library likely created the June 1979 copies. In an unusual twist, the machine had been loaded with expensive Hammermill bond paper after running out of cheaper stock. A library clerk remembered this happening in June 1979, when a woman needed immediate use of the machine. The February 1978 copies were likely made on an IBC copier 2 in the basement of Wichita State University's Life Sciences building. The machine typically used cheap electrostatic paper that caused frequent jams. The clerk remembered that in February 1978, they had to use their last cartridge of different toner, Nashua toner, the only time the toner was ever used in that machine. A third machine in WSU's Jardine Hall matched the characteristics, but was taken out of service just 10 days after the June 1979 BTK letter was received, a timing that couldn't be coincidental. This meticulous forensic work painted a picture of someone familiar with the WSU campus and downtown Wichita, someone who could access these machines without suspicion. When Dennis Rader was finally arrested in 2005, the world got to see the man behind the BTK letters. But nothing could have prepared observers for what they witnessed during his sentencing hearing. Rader avoided the death penalty because his crimes were committed before Kansas reinstated capital punishment in 1994. During the hearing, victims' relatives finally got their chance to face their tormentor and deliver impact statements. What they saw was chilling, not because Rader was particularly frightening to look at, but because of his complete emotional detachment. He described his gruesome crimes without any signs of remorse, as if he were presenting a slideshow at a business meeting. He shared horrific details, like how he discarded Dolores Davis's body under a bridge, only to return later when it had decomposed, place a female mask over her face, and photograph her for his fantasies. His testimony revealed the full extent of his delusional thinking. He stated that his victims would serve him as sex slaves in the afterlife. He claimed the same fate awaited Shirley Vian and indicated he would have murdered her daughter and other children if a phone call hadn't interrupted him. Then he said something that perfectly captured his fractured psychology. "I probably would have hung the little girl. Like I said, I'm pretty mean, or could be. But on the other hand, I'm very, I'm a nice guy." This glaring contradiction, his ability to separate his brutal BTK persona from his regular Dennis Rader life, seemed to completely elude him. His compartmentalized existence had allowed him to avoid psychological distress for decades. But when family members called him a coward during their impact statements, Rader appeared visibly upset. Before sentencing, he delivered what some described as an Oscar acceptance speech, a self-absorbed 20-minute statement where he tearfully acknowledged his mistakes, thanked his supporters, and astonishingly drew parallels between his situation and his victims. His superficial expressions of regret fell flat in the courtroom. Many victims' relatives left before his final remarks, having said what they came to say. After his statement, Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences. As we close this examination of Dennis Rader and his BTK crimes, we're left with uncomfortable questions that extend far beyond one man's twisted psychology. How many Dennis Raders are out there right now, sitting in church pews, working in office buildings, coaching little league teams, living double lives that none of us can imagine? How many seemingly ordinary community members are harboring fantasies that could one day become horrific realities? The BTK case shattered Wichita's sense of security, but it should serve as a wake-up call for all of us. Evil doesn't always announce itself with wild eyes and erratic behavior. Sometimes it wears a badge, sits on church councils, and maintains perfect attendance at community meetings. Rader's 30-year reign of terror ended not because of some dramatic confrontation, but because of his own narcissism and need for attention. That newspaper article suggesting BTK was dead wounded his ego so deeply that he couldn't resist resurfacing, and that vanity ultimately led to his downfall. The investigation that finally caught him showcased both the evolution of forensic science and the timeless importance of meticulous detective work. From analyzing paper and toner combinations to tracking digital metadata, investigators used every tool available to build an unbreakable case. But perhaps the most important lesson from the BTK case is this. In our communities, among our neighbors, colleagues, and fellow citizens, we must remain vigilant without becoming paranoid, aware without losing our humanity. Dennis Rader spent 30 years hiding in plain sight, and he probably would have taken his secrets to the grave if not for his overwhelming need to be remembered, to be significant, to matter in some twisted way. Today, he sits in a prison cell, serving 10 consecutive life sentences, no longer the center of anyone's attention, no longer significant or feared. He's exactly what he was before he became BTK, an insignificant, ordinary man whose only claim to fame is the suffering he caused innocent people. The victims of BTK, the Oteros, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicki Wegerle, and Dolores Davis, they were the ones who truly mattered. They were loved, missed, mourned. Their lives had meaning beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Dennis Rader wanted to be remembered as BTK, a notorious killer who terrorized a city. Instead, he should be remembered as what he truly was, a coward who preyed on innocent people and spent 30 years running from justice. That's the real story of BTK, not the story of a criminal mastermind, but the story of a pathetic individual whose need for attention finally exceeded his ability to hide. This is only the beginning of the chilling story behind Dennis Rader, the man known as BTK, bind, torture, kill. To uncover the full truth about how he deceived his community for decades and how he was finally brought to justice, make sure to download the Skoob app on the App Store or Play Store. We'll be taking a deeper dive into the psychology, the investigation, and the terrifying double life of one of America's most infamous serial killers. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and this is Serial Killer Files, brought to you by Skoob, where we explore the darkest corners of true crime.